Hey, hey all. It's Dr. Wegner. Uh, so, uh, okay. Uh, Sorry about that. I got a warning message and wanted to keep going. All right, anyway. So I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit more about cannabis. So we're going to do this in chunks. So for each lecture now, I'm going to try really hard to make sure that I do lecture objectives. And then I'm going to chunk up my videos so that each video addresses one lecture objective. So the first one's just going to be cannabis history and context. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter video just because I don't have a ton of information here because I don't want to make you memorize a bunch. But I think this is kind of interesting and applies to your life. So I just want to tell you guys a little bit about it. So cannabis. I'm going to do my best to refer to it as cannabis. It's also, I mean, there's a bunch of different names that people use for it, but marijuana is a common one as well. Marijuana specifically refers to the flowering tops or the buds of the cannabis plant. Sometimes people use it to refer to the whole cannabis plant. I'm going to try and not use the word marijuana because it was mostly started entering common vernacular in the 1950s and 60s when the establishment and the government was trying to link cannabis to dangerous immigrants and found that the word marijuana sounded more foreign and more you could link it more easily with like dangerous outsiders. So marijuana has a little bit of a pejorative tint to it, so I'm going to try and use cannabis as much as I can. The other reason I'm going to do this is because cannabis works well with the actual chemical class and the synaptic receptors that we're going to be talking about when we talk about cannabis. So just to keep everything consistent. There are several different species of cannabis: sativa, indica, and ruderalis. Most people who are smoking cannabis are using sativa and indica. Sativa is also used for hemp. Indica is most common for medical and recreational use. And ruderalis doesn't really come up much in America because it's mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe. So the thing is, one of the differences between the different species of cannabis is that there's very different amounts of various chemicals or cannabinoids even within the same species. So most people are fairly familiar with these chemicals. We'll talk more about them later. But the three are THC, CBD, and CBN, which is cannabidiol and cannabinol are the latter two, and THC is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinoid. So, but even within the same species, you can end up with very different amounts of THC within a species. So as you can see, the percent of THC within cannabis has skyrocketed, and in the 70s, like it would be much further down, like around 2. So as we selectively breed cannabis for the purpose of recreation, we just make the THC content higher and higher. If you go to a state where cannabis is legal, like Oregon or Colorado, and you go to a cannabis store, they will take you through all the different strains that they have available in that particular store and the amount of THC versus CBD versus CBN within that strain. And the different amounts within each strain are going to give you some slightly different effects, just your personal user experience. That's going to be because the different cannabinoids are going to interact with different receptors, which are found in different places within your central nervous system. But we're going to talk about that more later. So a little bit of history. So cannabis has been around for a really long time. There is an archaeological record of cannabis existing in 8000 BCE, which is a super long time ago. And it's been used for religious and medical use in China and India and the Arab world for thousands of years. The Western world learns of bioactivity in the 1850s, mostly through a guy named Dr. O'Shaughnessy. He basically introduced cannabis. He traveled the world and found the use or was exposed to the use of cannabis for medicine in the East, in China and India through travel. And he decides, wow, this stuff is really great. I'm going to bring it back to Western medicine. He suggested it being used as an anticonvulsant, basically an anti-seizure medication, and an appetite stimulant. The appetite stimulant is actually a common medical use now, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Anticonvulsant needs more research. So there are people, especially now that CBD is so huge, that just swear that CBD oil has stopped their seizures, and but the research on it is pretty weak. We haven't looked that much into it. In 1870, it sort of becomes more widestream. In 1916, the USDA says, hey, you know what? We should grow more cannabis and use it to make paper. That way we can, reduce lumber, and we can use lumber for other things. So let's make the most out of this new resource we have of cannabis. Right. So in the 1920s, that's when the use of the word marijuana starts coming into common vernacular, and this specific word is being used to link Mexican American and African American people with violent acts. So marijuana is something that dangerous others use, and it causes them to be violent. That's sort of the idea behind the use of the word marijuana. So that's why we're going to try and not use it so much, right? Ugh. So. In America, we have a real mixed bag of our interactions with cannabis. In the 1920 through 37, basically that's when the prohibition of alcohol was happening. It failed, right? Everybody was still drinking. There was just happening in speakeasies, and people were being raided, and you had rum runners and stuff like that. And in addition to this, we were then talking about, in addition to people sneaking alcohol, people turn to something like cannabis for recreational purposes. It's not outlawed at this point, and whether or not it's being referred to as marijuana is pretty varied at this point, depending on where you are and who's talking about it. You might hear marijuana, but cannabis is still going to be a really common word that you use. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 did not outlaw cannabis or make it illegal to use, but it did create a really, really high price on the grower, distributor, seller, and buyer. So basically, this is what we've tried to do with cigarettes, is make the taxes on them so high that it almost becomes cost prohibitive to even use it. So the cannabis and hemp industry suffers as a result and really began to weaken. Additionally, around the same time in 1936, a movie called Reefer Madness came out. If you haven't seen this, you might want to. It's pretty interesting. It is so very clearly propaganda. Like, it's not even trying to hide the fact that it's propaganda. So now when you watch it, it just seems sort of absurd and ridiculous and humorous. However, this was a movement put forth by the federal government, by federal officials led by Harry Anslinger. It basically was trying to put out the widespread message that using cannabis or marijuana or reefer causes permanent brain damage. It causes people to be violent, and that it's dangerous. It's also, we're linking it again to undesirable immigrants who are bringing this dangerous substance into the country to corrupt your children. That's the basic message of Reefer Madness, and all the terrible things that can happen if you use marijuana. So now that just seems sort of absurd and ridiculous, but it was fairly effective at the time. In the 1950s and 60s, the recreational use became way, way, way more common. So in the 1970s, there was basically a big crackdown. We increased regulations and restrictions on the use of marijuana. Marijuana became a Schedule I drug. There's going to be a top hat question about this. So remember, a Schedule I drug is a drug that has no medical use and a high potential of abuse, meaning that it's most likely going to be very reinforcing or addictive. So I'm going to ask you to make a judgment call about whether or not you think marijuana is a Schedule I drug. And if it's not going to be Schedule I, which one should it be? And I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of the different schedules. So I'll ask you to form an opinion about this. That'll be completed for just participation, no correctness points. So as we move into the 2000s, there's some relaxation of the regulations. Medical use has become legal in some places. Recreational is used in some places as well. So there's a few different statuses of marijuana depending on where you are in the country. So here we are in Tennessee, where it is fully illegal. In a lot of countries on the East Coast and some on the on the West Coast and some on the East Coast, it's fully legalized, meaning you can use it whichever way you want. If it's medical and decriminalized, that means that there's medical uses. It's approved for medical uses, which are often things like treatment of anorexia or treatment of or chronic pain. That's a common use as well. Uh, and it's decriminalized, meaning that if you were caught with marijuana and you didn't have a reason to have it medically, you would most likely get a fine. You wouldn't go to jail. Medical is medical use. Decriminalized mean you only have the decriminalized. This is a combination, and then there's fully illegal. Right. So that is it for the cannabis history and context. So this is the end of this video. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about different cannabinoids, the types, their uses, and their pharmacokinetics.